Boston University in 2009 and a PhD at University of Pennsylvania in 2014. And since then, she's been at Rutgers on a postdoc working on this research. And next month, she's going to join us at the USGS. So let's welcome her.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Good. Okay. So thanks, Lisa, for the introduction. So I'm Nicole Kahn. I'm currently a postdoc at Rutgers University, like Lisa just mentioned, and I'm really excited to be down in St. Petersburg very soon to join you all to maybe facilitate some research or interactions in the future. So today I'm going to talk to you mostly about work that I've been doing during my postdoc. And this is to understand Holocene sea level change from near, intermediate, and far field locations, and I'll define what those terms mean later on. But my talk is really roughly going to follow two parts. So first, I'm going to describe the standardized approach that we use to collect sea level data, and I'm going to talk about the application of this approach to collate a database of Holocene sea levels for the Caribbean region. And then I'm going to talk about how this standardized approach can be applied to global data sets, and then highlight how data sets of this type might be able to fingerprint sources of ice melt. So this figure here, it's from a recent review in Science by Andrea Dutton and colleagues that came out this summer, and it just provides some context for this type of work. So this paper, it was about sea level rise due to polar ice sheet mass during past warm periods or interglacials where sea level was higher than present. And CO2 levels were at levels that are analogous to future emissions scenarios. So we know that there's a relationship between sea level and temperature, and then also temperature and, CO2 and temperature and sea level. And so what this is, so we want to better understand in the future the sensitivity of these ice sheets in these previous warm periods to these projected warming or past warming scenarios. And so in order to do this and to tease out the sensitivity of these ice sheets in a global mean sea level signal, we need to employ geophysical models. So the Holocene, the period of time that I'm going to be focusing on today, is the period of time, it's the current interglacial, and we have the most data, that's sea level data and climate data, to constrain these geophysical models. So before we can start to apply these models to past warm periods to understand ice sheet sensitivity, we need to test it on Holocene data. So this is a figure here. It's from a geophysical modeling study of the glacial isostatic adjustment process from a seminal study by Clark and colleagues in 1978. And so this figure, it shows two important things. First, it demonstrates the spatial variability that you get across the globe in sea level over the Holocene. And it also demonstrates why you need geophysical models to tease out a eustatic or a global mean sea level signal from these very spatial variable sea level trends. And so just to define what I mean by near field, intermediate field, and far field sea level histories, here in type 1 and type 1-2 transition sea level histories, and so these are polar regions or where you have large ice sheets. So these are called near field locations. So these are locations that were positioned under former ice sheets. And their relative sea level histories in the Holocene are characterized by a fall to present. So this is because the weight of the ice sheet, it displaced the land below it and it pressed it. And so as these ice sheets melted, you have isostatic rebound of the land and a rise in land level, and so a fall in relative sea level. Then we have our type 2, which is intermediate field sea level records. And so these locations, they were located on the periphery of former ice masses. And so these locations, they have a continuous rise in relative sea level in the Holocene. And this is related to the collapse of the proglacial forebulge that was created from these large ice sheets. And finally, we have far field sea level records. so type 3, 4, and 5, and these are distal to former ice centers. And so these locations are located far enough away from these former ice centers that they're not significantly influenced by this process. So I've sort of just talked about this on the previous slide, but since relative sea level is the height of the ocean surface relative to the solid Earth, you can get a change in relative sea level by a change in the height of the sea surface or in the change of the height of the land surface. So what will cause change in ocean volume? So we have eustatic factors. So this can be thermosteric effects, so thermal expansion or contraction of water from changes in temperature. These are related to ice volume, so ice melt from large ice masses will cause an increase in the water in ocean in the ocean volume. We have the static equilibrium effect, and that's basically the fingerprinting signal, which I'll talk about later on in the talk. And that has to do with gravity-driven redistribution of mass in the ocean, interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere, the glacial isostatic adjustment process, which just touched upon, and then land level movements from tectonics. And then we have local effects, and I'll talk about this later on, but this is related to changes in tidal range over time, perhaps, or sediment compaction. Comparing this, so this is demonstrating relative sea level variability, and these are present day relative sea level rates of change predicted from the ICE6GC VM6 model from Dick Peltier. And so you can roughly make out what our near, intermediate, and far field sites are. So in our pinks and our grays, we have our near field sites. In our greens and our blues, we have our intermediate field sites. And then our whites, yellows, and oranges are far field sites. But you can see it's not quite as simple as the previous model from Clark et al. Might suggest. So how do we reconstruct changes in sea level? Well, we need to follow a standardized approach so that we can make comparisons from different sites across the globe. And so we follow an approach that was developed in international geological correlations programs from the 1970s to present, where each sample or each sea level index point or data point must have the following three pieces of information known. So it must have a location, so this is simply a latitude or a longitude, geographical coordinates that describe the sample's location. 2, an age, calibrated to years before present. And then 3, an elevation related to former sea level, and this is expressed using a relationship known as the indicative meaning of the sample, and I'll get to that. So skipping location, because that's simply just getting a GPS coordinate or a lat long, we'll move on to the age attribute of an index point. So in the example that I'm going to provide you in the Caribbean, we made the following sort of screening and calibration assessments for each sample in the database. A number of samples in the database, they came from bulk mangrove peat samples that were from studies from the 1970s. Before AMS radiocarbon dates were available. So samples such as these, because they may be influenced by younger roots penetrating down to depth, causing younger carbon to be incorporated into the bulk peat, or conversely, because bulk peats may be influenced by the hard water effect, so olds, radiocarbon dead, carbon from carbonates being incorporated into the sample. So we apply a plus or minus 100-year bulk peat error to these peat samples. We apply a sample-specific error for isotopic fractionation for each of these samples. Samples that come from marine carbonates, we apply a reservoir correction when appropriate or when available. And then we combine all of these errors and then take that error plus laboratory error and calibrate them using the most recent INCAL 13 and Marine 13 calibration data sets. So in the Caribbean database, I'll get to again, a few of the corals, or about 75 of the corals, dated using the uranium-thorium method. And so we recalculated the ages of these samples, and I worked with Andrea Dutton on this using the new Chang at all half-life or decay constants. And then we also screened the samples for open system behavior based on detrital thorium contents or measured activity ratios of the samples. And then getting onto the elevation of an index point. So this is the Y position of a sample. We use the indicative meaning of a sample. So the indicative meaning, it's a term that describes a sample's relationship to sea level in the modern environment. So the indicators in this Caribbean database, we use mangrove peats and corals, like I mentioned. And so the indicative meaning, it carries two components. So it has an indicative range, and so that's the vertical range that the indicator that you're using occupies in the modern environment. And then the reference water level, which is just the midpoint of the indicative range. So for mangrove peats, we assign an indicative meaning of mean tide level to highest astronomical tide. And for Acropora palmata corals, we inside them an indicative meaning of 5 meters below mean low or low water. Then we can also define terrestrial and marine limiting dates. So freshwater peats that form above mean tide level, they delimit the lower limit of sea level, and then marine mollusks or invertebrates, they delimit the upper position of, the upper bound of sea level. So these occur below mean tide level. And so we can also use indicators such as foraminifera, diatoms, and what I worked on during my PhD was using bulk stable carbon isotopes of sediment to further constrain these samples' indicative meaning. So once you've established this indicative meaning, you can then produce a sea level index point. The position of the relative sea level, the vertical position of this index point is determined using this relationship, where you take the altitude in the core and subtract off the reference water level. So here in this example sediment core, we have our mangrove indicator, which occurs at this depth in the core, and we get the relative sea level position that it indicates by subtracting off its reference water level. Conversely, likewise, we have our A. palmata coral indicators, and then again, because these samples form below mean sea level, we subtract off the reference water level to get the position of sea level that it indicates. And then, as I mentioned before, we have our marine and freshwater indicators that delimit the lower and upper position of relative sea level, respectively. So one advancement that we've made in this Caribbean database is that we can account for changes in tidal range over time. So because the distribution of our indicators is related to tide levels, a change in tide levels in the past will bias our past interpretations. So we use the paleotidal model of David Hill, published in JGR in 2011, to provide an additional error for samples in the past. So this is a figure here showing present-day tidal range for the Caribbean region. And we can see that it's microtidal and that most locations in the area have a tidal range of less than 1 meter. And then if we go back in time, we see that tidal range was relatively constant back up until around 8 to 10 Ka when tides blew up in this region, reaching levels of almost 1.5 meters. So we can correct for this by adding an additional error to samples. Another process that results in the downward displacement of samples is sediment compaction, and so it lowers the position of an index point and then your past estimate of relative sea level. So we can account for this by classifying index points based on their position in a stratigraphic sequence. So we have basal index points, and so these come from a peat sequence that overlies an incompressible surface in the Caribbean. This is usually limestone bedrock. And it's believed that these samples experience minimum effects from compaction. And then we have our intercalated samples, and so these are peat samples that form interleaved between two clastic sequences. And we believe that these types of samples experience the greatest effects from sediment compaction. So on the next slide, I'll show you some measurements related to to sediment compaction, such as overburden thickness, which is the thickness of the unit lying above an index point, the depth to basement, so that's the thickness of the sedimentary unit to the incompressible surface, and then the total thickness of the sedimentary sequence, and how we can use relationships between these samples and basal index points to correct for, or at least account for, the effects of sediment compaction. So here I'm showing, this is an example from Jamaica where we have a good temporal distribution of basal and intercalated index points. And so we fit a regression model to these basal data, basal index points, and we look at residuals between this model and the intercalated index points. And so then we can plot these residuals against the measurements that I mentioned on the previous slide, and do a linear regression to look at the coefficients or the relationship between these two variables. And so we find that overburden thickness has a significant relationship to the residuals from the basal model. So we can use this regression coefficient to shift up these intercalated samples by an amount that's proportional to this regression coefficient. In addition, we add an error in the downward direction that's proportional to this shift upwards, so that the lower bound of relative sea level remains unchanged. So I'm just going to briefly go through an example of how we do this, and this comes from a project in my PhD where I produced a sea level for the record for the island of Puerto Rico. And so this is based on sites located across the island where we have modern transects. So we try to understand the indicative meaning of the samples that we're using to reconstruct sea level, and then sediment cores from the north coast, the site in Sabana Seca, in Hobos Bay. So to give you an example of one of the modern transects where we sample from a range of elevations, so from low elevation tidal flats in through mangrove and supertidal environments. So here's one example of two transects from a site in Espiritu Santo, plotted over here on the right. And so here we have distance across transect, and then elevation, and then the depositional environment of samples. And so now we can look at the sediment, the bulk sediment geochemistry, and we see that there's a relationship with elevation going across transects. And then foraminiferal abundances, so we can see that you have species turnover with increasing elevation, so that we can use these relationships then reconstruct past sea level. This is an example transect of cores that we collected from the site on the southern coast of Puerto Rico in Hobos Bay. And so here's this transect A to A prime. And then we sampled a sediment core, and we dated the contact between a shell hash unit and a mangrove peat. And we analyzed the bulk geochemistry and the forams going down the core. And we find that, that the proxy data indicates that the contact is conformable, and this radiocarbon dated contact is indicative of deposition within a mangrove peat environment. So we can use this date to reconstruct the position of sea level. So we've done this for about 24, to produce 24 sea level index points for the island of Puerto Rico. And so to orient you in how I'm plotting this data, on the y-axis we have relative sea level, where 0 is present day level, and then on the x-axis we have age, where 0 is present day, going back in time to 12,000 years. And then we've plotted our index points, where we have our intercalated index points in red, our basal index points in blue, and then our then coral index points plotted in black, and our freshwater and our marine limiting data. And then plotted here in purple, so this is a Gaussian process regression model. So it's part of a larger hierarchical statistical modeling framework that relates data points over time and over space. And I've been working with a statistics grad student at Rutgers, Erica Ash, who's a student of Bob Kopp, to develop this model. So this is just showing here in purple this model fit to the data, where in the solid black line you have the model mean, and then the 1 and 2 sigma uncertainties the mean. And so this is showing the distribution of all the data in the Caribbean. So here's a plot showing the spatial distribution, where in green through red Increasingly warm color shows more data at each site. In total, we have 502 index points and 242 limiting dates from 20 regions in the Caribbean. That we subdivided the regions based on their distance related to the Laurentide ice sheet and then their local tectonic setting. This here shows the temporal distribution of data in the database. And we have an atypical distribution of data where we actually get the most number of data points between 6,000 and 8,000 years before present. And this is showing all of the data for the region. And so this really brings home the point that over this spatial extent, one single sea level curve doesn't accurately describe the sea level history. So this is the data subdivided among each region. And I've shown here the island sites in the Caribbean, so the Bahamas and the Greater Antilles chain down through the Lesser Antilles chain, and then Curacao and Trinidad and Tobago located off the southern coast of South America, or the northern coast of South America. And we can see very similar trend in the relative sea level histories, where we have high rates of relative sea level rise in the early Holocene until about 6,000 or 7,000 years. And then at around that time it slows, and we have a slow or gradual rise of relative sea level to present. And then if we move on to our continental locations, so from southern Florida through the Central American coast, Mexico, Belize, Honduras, Panama, and then the northern coast of South America, from Colombia, Venezuela, down to Suriname and Guyana, we see generally a similar trend in these sea level histories until we get to Suriname and Guyana, where we find evidence for higher sea levels than present. So then we can compare this data, or a subset of this data, to glacial-isostatic adjustment models to try to validate these models. So if they fit this data well, these models are describing, or at least predicting, the glacial-isostatic adjustment process well. And so here are the three island sites in the Caribbean. So we've got Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and St. Croix. And this comes from the ICE6GC ice model and VM5A Earth model. We can see that it fits the data relatively well in all the sites. But then when we move to our continental sites in Florida, Belize, and Suriname,